Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to be talking about aircraft classes, not classes where you learn how to fly, or classes that young aircraft attend to learn how to read and write, but classes that they are divided into, how the planes are categorized. Planes are most often built with a very specific role in mind. Some do manage to defy convention and perform a multitude of different roles, but generally, and especially with older aircraft, specific roles and functions lead to certain design characteristics. Interceptors prioritize speed, rate of climb, and agility. Bombers prioritize range and carrying capacity. Escorts largely prioritize range, etc., etc. Two of these categories that aren't really a thing anymore, but were quite prevalent up through the Second World War, were the dive and torpedo bomber classes. Now, with both of them being a subcategory of bombers, one may assume that the two could be pretty interchangeable. It just depended on if you wanted a torpedo or some bombs fitted on. But how each of these would be used would be quite different and would require different things. Torpedo bombers would generally stay lower to sea level and would conduct their attack flying mostly level. Additionally, their payload would generally be much larger, typically lugging around a roughly 2,000-pound torpedo. Dive bombers, on the other hand, started their attacks from high in the sky, before diving just about straight down at their target. These planes typically held less in their total payloads, generally up around 1,000 pounds at most, but it certainly could exceed that for some models. These planes needed more agility, so they could pull up from their dives and not crash. And also they needed better frame strength so that the G-forces experienced on the dive didn't rip them to shreds. To put things simply, torpedo bombers needed better carrying capacity, while dive bombers needed better maneuverability. Of course, there was some overlap between the two classes. Both of them were often quite sluggish when compared to fighters. They wouldn't typically be attacking fast-moving targets after all, and because of their slow speed, they would typically be outfitted with defensive weaponry, most often in the form of a rear-facing turret controlled by a second pilot. This division of two classes was less done out of some organizational desire, but more out of a technological necessity. If a plane was built for one of these purposes, it very often was basically stuck in that role. A major factor in this was engine technology. With higher power engines, it would be easier to create an aircraft that could fit into multiple roles, but with the engines they had at the time, they were much more limited. However, for today's aircraft, they were at a point where the ever-progressing march of technology gave them the opportunity to do something more innovative, to advance past the need for designated dive and torpedo bombers and towards a single unifying class, the attack class. This is a plane that was built to be a dive bomber, a torpedo bomber, perhaps a level bomber, honestly whatever they wanted it to do. This is the Martin AM Mauler. The Mauler begins back in 1943 with a desire from the U.S. Navy to better utilize the limited space on aircraft carriers. Instead of having several different planes for several different roles, they would ideally just have one plane that could swap between these roles, thus making outfitting carriers an easier and more logistically friendly endeavor. Because engine technology was greatly improving, jet engines were right around the corner, the Navy decided to push the envelope a bit and requested a massive, high-powered, multi-role, single-seat, single-engine aircraft. Up until now, most dive and torpedo bombers came standard with at least two pilots, both for assisting in bomb aiming and for manning the defensive turret. However, it was also found that the main pilot often didn't need the second pilot to help him aim the bombs. and with the requested plane being much faster than anything before it, the second pilot wouldn't be needed for manning a turret that wouldn't be there. For this request, 4 major designs would be presented for consideration. From Kaiser-Fleetwings came the XBTK, from Curtiss came the XBTC, from Douglas came the XBT2D Skyraider, and from Martin came the XBTM. The least successful of these was the Curtiss XBTC, as Curtiss was in the midst of a prolonged and painful journey with the SB-2C Helldiver. Just 4 total XBTCs were ordered on low priority, and just 2 of them were ever made. One of them ended up crashing. The second least successful was the Kaiser-Fleetwings XBTK, with just 5 total aircraft being made. The smallest of the 4 designs, the XBTK, would also be the least powerful of them, outfitted with a 2100 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. The 3 other models up for consideration were outfitted with either a 2700 horsepower Wright R3350 or a 3000 horsepower R4360. In the end, the XBTK would largely be done in by its timing. It was the last of the 4 to take to the air, and by the time it managed to work out some of its kinks, the 2 more successful aircraft were much further along and were more promising, leaving the XBTK to be forgotten about. In second place for success is our subject for today, the Mauler. Out of the 4 models, the Mauler was certainly the heavyweight of the group, measuring in at 12.57 meters long, 15.24 meters wide, and 5.13 meters tall, weighing in at 14,500 pounds empty and a whopping 23,386 pounds gross. The Mauler was the heaviest of the bunch, and nearly matched the gross weight of the twin-engine Douglas A-1 Havoc, a medium bomber. The reason for this substantial gross weight was the variability provided by its 15 underwing and underbody hardpoints. 3 of the hardpoints, 1 under the fuselage, and 2 about a third of the way out on the wings, were designed for larger explosive payloads, either bombs or torpedoes that weighed upwards of 2,200 pounds each. Then, around the midpoint of each wing, a total of 12 smaller hardpoints could fit either a 250-pound bomb each or a 5-inch rocket each. Adding all of that up, in external carrying capacity alone, the Mauler could have up to 9,600 pounds of explosives. Again, if we compare that to the Douglas A-20, the Mauler could carry more than double what the A-20 could. In effect, if needed, the Mauler could serve as a more unconventional level bomber and probably be pretty good at it. Of course, this was definitely on the upper echelon of what it could carry, and this would not be a standard outfit, as that outfit would vary on the mission. As a standard, likely around 4,500 pounds of ordnance would be equipped. Further adding to the weight of the Mauler, though, was its ranged armament of 4 20mm cannons with 200 rounds per gun. With the maximum external payload of 9,600 pounds, and the added interior armament weight of the 4 guns and all of the ammo, the Mauler would actually end up setting an unofficial record for the most weight carried by a single-engine aircraft, at a staggering 10,689 pounds. The total weight of the plane with this payload was likely over 29,000 pounds, according to a Martin aircraft advertisement. I should also note, though, that 2 sources, the U.S. Naval Institute and the book Aircraft Carriers by Norman Polmar, list the record flight at 14,179 pounds, although the U.S. Naval Institute article was actually a piece written by Polmar, so two sources from the same guy. The weight that I went with, though, is the one that's noted on the National Naval Aviation Museum's website. But anyway, with a maximum carrying capacity of over 2/3 of its empty weight, the Mauler would need a powerful engine to go along with it, and it would be outfitted with an improved version of the Wright R3350 at 2,950 horsepower. Once again, though, I do have to mention that some sources list the 4360 engine as the one being installed on the production version of the Mauler. Again, I will defer to the National Naval Aviation Museum, and that lists the 3350 engine. Now, it does appear as though early versions of the Mauler, when it was called the XBTM, actually used the 4360, but later on this was changed to the 3350 somewhere in testing. We'll get to the point where I think it changed later on. But anyway, again, combining this higher power engine with its tremendous gross weight would give the Mauler a rather middling top speed if compared to a fighter aircraft, but compared to the planes it was supposed to replace, the TBF Avenger and the SB-2C Helldiver, it was a good deal faster, with a top speed of 367 miles an hour at 11,000 feet, a service ceiling of 30,500 feet, and a range upwards of 1,800 miles. The Mauler had nearly double the range of the Avenger and Helldiver, along with being at least 60 miles an hour faster than either of them. The service ceiling was about the same, but considering the roles each of these planes would fill, significant improvement in this area wasn't really necessary. Now, all of these relatively impressive specifications and later feats being said, things early on for the Mauler were pretty rough. First flying on August 26, 1944, the earliest of the four models up for consideration, the then-named XBTM displayed quite a few issues. Because of its sheer bulk, the early Maulers displayed rather poor maneuverability, and in particular had quite the poor roll rate. There were also issues with the design of the engine cowling, and the overall torque of the engine simply being too much for the frame. In all likelihood, at this point, the engine was the 4360, an engine that saw most of its use on multi-engine bombers. Despite these initial issues, the military was apparently satisfied enough, or perhaps blinded, by the ordnance-carrying potential of the Mauler to place an order for 750 aircraft in January 1945. In the meantime, redesigns of the rudder, vertical stabilizer, and propeller were all undertaken to help solve the maneuverability issues. Additionally, the engine cowling would be enlarged by a few inches, and it would actually be offset by just a couple degrees in an effort to counter the sheer torque of the engine. In essence, the nose of the Mauler was now like a veteran boxer. Later on, in 1945, the Mauler project would suffer a significant blow with the end of World War II. The Navy planned on using the Mauler and its impressive carrying capacity against Japan, so once the war ended, they didn't need 750 new aircraft. That order would be reduced down to just 99. While these redesigns, order changes, and prototype flight testings continued, the Navy would make an alteration to their classification system that would alter the name of the Mauler. Their old bomber torpedo classification was replaced with just a simplified attack category. To the BT of the original XBTM would be changed to just an A, so the new classification for the Mauler was now simply AM. By December 16, 1946, the official production model AM-1 Mauler was ready to be tested, and these tests would extend into and through 1947, where again it showed some serious issues. In addition to being overall difficult to control and still displaying poor maneuverability, The Mauler was also disliked by maintenance crew for being an absolute headache to work on. Additionally, when it went through carrier acceptance tests, an issue was found that, if left alone, could be incredibly deadly and costly. Because of the plane's size, landing on the carrier was a challenge in of itself, and the landing had to be very precise. If the landing was a little bit rough, the Mauler had this alarming tendency to bounce after hitting the deck, which often meant that its tailhook would simply bounce over the arresting cables on the deck that helped slow the plane down. If this wasn't bad enough, on one particular test, some structural weakness was found on a rough landing that saw the entire back half of the fuselage be ripped off. It's around here that I think the 4360 engine would be swapped out for the 3350. If the Mauler was still suffering issues caused in part by the weight, and it had issues with excessive engine torque, I would imagine that around here the slightly less powerful and lighter 3350 engine would be swapped in for the design. I didn't find anything that says this explicitly, let me make that clear, this is my own guess here, but from what I have read, this seems, to me anyway, to be the most likely explanation as to why some sources list the 4360 and some the 3350. Some other changes around this time were additional reinforcements to the frame, the ailerons would be altered, and the elevators would be altered as well. By March 1948, even though the Mauler had yet to pass the carrier tests, the first aircraft were delivered to the Atlantic for Attack Squadron 17A. It would continue carrier testing in the meantime, while also being stationed on carriers. There wasn't a war now, so I guess they were a bit more lenient and blasé about things. A few months later, in May, an additional 50 planes were ordered for production. By early 1949, the Mauler finally passed the carrier tests, and things were really looking up for the design. It took a little while, but it finally made it. Only then, in October 1949, any ideas for additional Maulers would be dead, and production was ceased. A grand total of 151 AM-1 Maulers would be constructed, including the prototypes, and by late 1950, all of them would be removed from active carrier duty and relegated to reserve land-based duty, serving in this role for just a few more years until 1953. So what happened exactly? Things were looking up for the Mauler, so why did it take a sudden nosedive? Two reasons. One, it's still controlled relatively poorly and pilots didn't like flying it. It wasn't as difficult to control as it was early on, certainly, but it wasn't pleasant. And two, they had a better replacement plane that was more than ready to take over. Douglas's model mentioned earlier on, now called the A-1 Skyraider. While this plane was smaller, with a lower top speed, lesser range, and lower overall carrying capacity, it was simply a better aircraft, easier to control, and with far less issues than the Mauler. It didn't have that raw power potential, but the Skyraider was much more practical and just much more liked than the Mauler was. The Skyraider would go on to have a production run of over 3,000, serving well in the Korean War and the Vietnam War, as one of the last piston-engine frontline aircraft in the U.S. arsenal. In the end, I think the core reason that the Mauler ended up failing was Martin being a little brazen with their design. Technology did improve quite a lot, and something like the Mauler was indeed possible, carrying the weight it could carry with just one engine. However, while possible, it wasn't all that practical yet. They could have this behemoth of a plane, but in combat, how well would the Mauler have performed? Or more specifically, how well would it have survived? How would its poor maneuverability have hindered it in combat? At the very least, the Mauler was an impressive technological display showing how far technology had come, but it was honestly not much more than that. It seems as though Martin was only thinking about whether they could and not whether they should. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. The whole confusion surrounding the engine, or engines, was really annoying when researching this plane. Some list one engine, some list the other, some actually both, just to really annoy me. Somebody should get Lockheed Martin on the horn. That's where Martin is today. They're the Martin in Lockheed Martin. And we should tell them to settle things here and now. I'm sure they'll get right on that. I'm sure they're not busy or anything. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.